In the 1850s, whilst mostly building ships in response to the building programs of France, news of the new American Merrimack-class frigates brought alarm to the halls of the Admiralty. They knew just how much trouble 6 large American frigates could be, and this time they didn't plan to get caught out. As a result, the existing program of large frigates that were already under construction was progressed further, with 2 ships, Mersey and Orlando, having been bouncing around the design program for about a year. First, they'd been listed as small frigates, then as frigate corvettes, and then finally as 36-gun frigates. The funds allocated to these 2 ships, plus a little bit of topping up, were allocated to the designated response, and the new designs for these ships' names would begin to take place. Like their rivals, they were immense. Now, rated for 40 large guns, they would be just over 335 foot long overall. Also similar to the American ships, they would have iron hull bracing, but unlike their counterparts, the frames and hull would be purpose-built, and much more powerful machinery, at just over 3,600 indicated horsepower, would be fitted. This would give the ships a top speed of 12.5 to 13 knots under steam and a little bit more under combined sail and steam. Initially designed to carry 28 10-inch muzzle-loading smoothbore shell guns on the main deck and another 12 68-pounder smoothbore guns on pivots on the upper deck, Orlando would be altered whilst under construction to carry another 10 guns for a total of 50. These being on the main deck and utilising 38 8-inch guns instead of the fewer but heavier 10-inch guns of the Mersey. However, despite being somewhat more successful a design than the Merrimacks, this was only a qualified success. Simply put, both classes exceeded the practical length of wooden ships, even with bracing, assuming that you wanted to build anything vaguely ship-shaped and wanted to move under your own power at any degree of speed. You could build a more barge-shaped hull at this kind of size, but that would of course be a lot slower, and thus nowhere near as useful for a navy. Ordered in March 1855, launched at the end of 1856, both ships would enter service in the summer of 1858, and after working up, both were sent to the North America station as a direct deterrent to the Merrimacks. This was only a partially successful mission, as the outbreak of the American Civil War saw the ships eventually head off elsewhere, since there was nothing much to do whilst the Americans fought themselves. Mersey in summer 1862 headed to Portsmouth for a long refit, and Orlando in 1863 headed off to the Mediterranean, although she worked her hull so much during that Atlantic crossing that she was almost immediately in dock for several months for repairs. In the mid-1860s, both ships would be rearmed, Mersey swapping 8 of her 10-inch muzzle-loading smoothbores for a quartet of 7-inch muzzle-loading rifles, and completely replacing her 68-pounders on the upper deck with more 7-inches. Orlando received a somewhat different refit, 4 7-inch muzzle-loading rifles on the main deck, but all other main and upper deck guns were replaced with 64-pounder muzzle-loading rifles. The ships did have one other major highlight though. Their hull lines and layout were used as a significant part of the design for the ironclads HMS Warrior and Black Prince, which in many ways could be described as Mersey-class, except built in iron, this iron construction obviating most of the issues with hull warping that had been faced by the wooden frigates. Orlando stayed in the Mediterranean until 1866 before being brought back to the UK and paid off into the reserves, whilst Mersey would come back into service after 5 years in Portsmouth and spend most of the time thereafter, until 1872, serving out of Queenstown, now Cobb, in Ireland. With the reduction of the threat of large wooden frigates as a result of the increasing number of ironclads, the utility of the ships was much reduced. Whilst they cost almost as much to run and were of about the same size as a first-rate ship of the line, they couldn't face off with such a ship in a straight-up combat, and even those first-rates were being seen as second-line warships at this point. But, since they looked impressive, they were still kept around for a few more years. However, with more modern and far less maintenance-intensive iron-hulled ships coming online, both armoured and not, the 2 ships were not kept in service for too much longer once the decade turned, Orlando being sold for breaking up in 1871 after only 12 years of service, with Mersey lasting 4 years longer, heading for the breakers in 1875.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.